There is a freedom that laws protect and a freedom that nothing can give you because nothing can take it. These two freedoms are often confused, and the confusion is costly. The freedom that laws protect, the freedom of movement, of speech, of association, is real, and its loss is a genuine loss. But the traditions that thought hardest about freedom, from Stoic philosophy to Viktor Frankl's phenomenology of the concentration camp to the Boethian tradition of consolation, were pointing at something that political theory cannot fully address. They were pointing at the inner life, the dimension of a person that remains capable of orientation, of choice, of dignity, even when the outer conditions have been stripped of every support. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a practical discovery made and confirmed by people who were tested in conditions that most of us will never face. What they found there is worth examining carefully. The distinction between inner and outer freedom is not obvious. In comfortable conditions, the two are easily confused. It is only when the outer freedom is removed by imprisonment, by illness, by the loss of everything one depended on, that the inner freedom becomes visible as a separate thing. The traditions that mapped this territory did so from within conditions of genuine deprivation. Their testimony is not theory, it is report. Epictetus was born a slave, probably in Hierapolis, in Phrygia, sometime around 50 CE. He was owned by a man named Epaphroditus, who was himself a freedman serving the Emperor Nero. The circumstances of Epictetus's enslavement were not, by the standards of the time, extraordinarily harsh. He was educated, he served in Rome, he had access to Stoic philosophy. But he was also, by legal definition, property. His life was not his own. It could be disposed of at another's will. This is the context in which Epictetus developed the most rigorous analysis of freedom in the ancient world and the most counterintuitive. In the Enchiridion, he begins, "Some things are in our control and others not. In our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. This is not a resignation to circumstances. It is a precise identification of where freedom actually lives and where it does not." Epictetus's distinction between what is up to us and what is not is deceptively simple. The mind wants to argue, surely my health is partly up to me. Surely my reputation can be influenced. And Epictetus would agree. You can influence these things, but you cannot control them. And the freedom he is describing lives only in what you can fully control: your judgments, your desires, your responses. Everything else is on loan from fortune, and fortune can recall the loan at any time. The ancient Stoic paradox that only the wise person is truly free, and that every fool is a slave sounds extreme until you observe it in practice. The person who cannot control their anger is enslaved by anger. The person who cannot resist flattery is enslaved by the need for approval. The person who cannot tolerate discomfort is enslaved by comfort. Inner freedom in the Stoic account is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of self-governance. And self-governance is the rarest form of government on earth. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who studied Epictetus, applied Stoic inner freedom from the opposite end of the social spectrum. He had everything the external world could offer: absolute power, unlimited wealth, the devotion of millions, and he found that none of it produced the inner condition he sought. His meditations are the private journal of a man who had everything and was trying to learn that having everything is not the same as being free. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who served as advisor to the Emperor Nero, wrote extensively about inner freedom while living in conditions of extraordinary luxury and extraordinary danger. He knew that his wealth and position could be removed at any moment by the emperor's whim, and they eventually were. His letters to Lucilius are, among other things, a sustained preparation for the loss of everything external. When the loss came, exile, confiscation, and finally the command to take his own life, Seneca met it with the equanimity he had been practicing. The practice, not the theory, is what held. Viktor Frankl arrived at a similar discovery through circumstances far more brutal. Auschwitz, Dachau, other camps between 1942 and 1945. The death of his wife, his parents, most of those he had known. In Man's Search for Meaning, written in 9 days immediately after liberation, he described what he had observed in the camps about human freedom. He had seen people who gave their last piece of bread to others. He had seen people who maintained dignity in conditions designed to strip it. And he had concluded not as a consolation, but as a phenomenological observation that the capacity to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances cannot be taken away by any external force. He called it the last of the human freedoms, not the first, not the most important in comfortable conditions, but the one that no force, however total, could entirely eliminate. Between stimulus and response, he wrote, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl's logotherapy, the psychotherapy he developed from his camp experience, is built on the premise that the primary human drive is not pleasure, as Freud argued, or power, as Adler argued, but meaning. The person who has a why to live, Frankl wrote, citing Nietzsche, can bear almost any how. The inner freedom he witnessed in the camps was not random. It correlated with the prisoners' capacity to find meaning in their suffering, not to justify it, not to excuse it, but to integrate it into a narrative larger than the suffering itself. Edith Stein, the Jewish-born philosopher who became a Carmelite nun and was murdered at Auschwitz, represents the convergence of intellectual freedom and spiritual freedom in the most extreme conditions. She had been Husserl's assistant, a phenomenologist of the first order. Her choice to enter a convent was not a retreat from thinking, but an intensification of it, a decision to orient her entire intellectual life toward what she understood as the ground of all meaning. Her inner freedom was tested at the point where philosophy and faith meet annihilation. Inner freedom is not a theory, it is a practical discovery made by people who were tested in conditions most of us will never face. Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher, spent 11 years in Mussolini's prisons, where he wrote the 33 notebooks that would become the prison notebooks, one of the most important works of political philosophy in the 20th century. His jailers tried to prevent him from thinking by isolating him and denying him books. They failed. The mind that produced the concept of cultural hegemony operated in conditions designed to shut it down. Gramsci's inner freedom was intellectual, the freedom to think, even when every other freedom had been removed. Boethius wrote The Consolation of Philosophy in 524 CE while awaiting execution. He had been one of the most powerful men in the Western Roman Empire, a senator, a consul, a philosopher of the first order who had translated Aristotle's logic into Latin and whose translations would form the intellectual foundation of medieval Europe. He was accused of treason, almost certainly falsely, by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, imprisoned and condemned to death. In prison, he wrote a dialogue between himself and Lady Philosophy, who appears to him in his cell and undertakes the work of reminding him of what he actually knew and had, in his distress, forgotten. The central argument of the Consolation is that fortune's gifts, wealth, power, honor, position, were never truly his to begin with. Fortune gives and fortune takes back. What remains when fortune has taken everything is what was always his: the rational soul, the capacity for virtue, the inner life that no prison and no executioner can reach. Boethius was not performing courage. He was thinking his way through to the ground that would hold him. The Consolation of Philosophy was the most widely read book in Europe after the Bible for nearly 1,000 years. It was translated by King Alfred, by Chaucer, by Queen Elizabeth I. Its message that the rational soul is free regardless of external conditions spoke to every generation that encountered imprisonment, exile, or the caprice of fortune. Boethius's discovery in a prison cell became the foundation of an entire civilization's understanding of inner freedom. Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor of England, who refused to endorse Henry VIII's break with Rome, spent 14 months in the Tower of London before his execution in 1535. In the Tower, he wrote, a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, a sustained meditation on inner freedom that draws on Boethius, Seneca, and his own Christian faith. More's humor never deserted him. On the scaffold, he asked the executioner to spare his beard, as it had committed no treason. The joke was the final expression of an inner freedom that the king's power could not reach. 2. The capacity to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances cannot be taken away by any external force. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent 8 years in the Soviet labor camps, the Gulag, arrested in 1945 for a critical remark about Stalin in a private letter, sentenced under Article 58 and processed through a system designed to reduce human beings to interchangeable units of productive labor. What he discovered in the camps, recorded first in the Gulag archipelago and more intimately in one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, was something structurally identical to what Epictetus had discovered 2 millennia earlier, and Frankl had discovered simultaneously in a different camp system. The inner life is not reducible to the outer conditions. The person who has not been enslaved internally cannot be enslaved by any external force, and the person who has surrendered themselves internally cannot be liberated by any change in external conditions. Solzhenitsyn, like Epictetus and Frankl, was not making this as a philosophical argument. He was reporting what he had seen. In the camps, he had met people who were free, and he had met people who, despite being in the same conditions, were not. Solzhenitsyn later wrote that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. This insight, gained in conditions that might have produced a simpler, more vengeful worldview, is itself evidence of inner freedom. The person who can observe their own capacity for evil while imprisoned by evil has achieved a vantage point that the outer conditions did not provide and cannot remove. Primo Levi, the Italian chemist who survived Auschwitz and wrote about it with the precision of a scientist, observed that the camps did not merely imprison the body, they attacked the soul's capacity for inner freedom by systematically degrading every aspect of human dignity. Levi's testimony is the most honest acknowledgement in the literature of inner freedom that the conditions can become so extreme that inner freedom itself is threatened. He did not romanticize survival. He reported what he saw with the accuracy of a witness who refuses to comfort the reader. Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald as a teenager, testified to the limits of inner freedom in night. There were moments, he wrote, when faith itself was murdered. The inner citadel was not always impregnable. The traditions of inner freedom must be read alongside these testimonies of its failure, not to refute the traditions, but to honor the honesty of those who found, in the most extreme conditions, that the inner resources were not always sufficient. The traditions describe what is possible. The witnesses describe what is actual. Both deserve to be heard. The person who has located their freedom in the inner life is in a position that is far more durable than the person who depends on favorable external conditions. The Bhagavad Gita, composed in India sometime between the 5th and 2nd centuries BCE, presents its teaching on inner freedom through the figure of Arjuna, a warrior paralyzed by the moral horror of the battle he must fight. Krishna's counsel to Arjuna is the most influential teaching on inner freedom in the Hindu tradition. Act without attachment to results. Perform the action that duty requires and release the outcome. This is not indifference. It is the discipline of placing one's freedom in the quality of one's action rather than in the results that action produces, results that are, in any case, never fully within one's control. The Gita's concept of nishkama karma, desireless action, is not the suppression of desire, but the redirection of the will from results to the quality of the action itself. The person who acts without attachment to results is not passive. They may act with tremendous energy and commitment, but their inner freedom is located in the acting, not in the outcome. This makes them unshakable in a way that the person attached to results can never be. The Zen concept of mushotoku without gain is the Eastern parallel to nishkama karma. The practitioner who sits in zazen for the purpose of gaining enlightenment has already failed. The sitting must be without purpose, not purposeless in the sense of meaningless, but purposeless in the sense of free from the desire for results. Inner freedom, in the Zen account, is not a goal to be achieved. It is the condition that exists when all goals have been released. Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery and then returned to the South 19 times to free others through the Underground Railroad, demonstrated inner freedom in its most active form. Her freedom was not the Stoic freedom of accepting what cannot be changed. It was the freedom of someone who has decided that what must be changed will be changed, regardless of the personal cost. She carried a revolver and told the escaping slaves that if they turned back, she would shoot them. Inner freedom, in Tubman's practice, was not passive. It was ferocious. Aung San Suu Kyi spent 15 years under house arrest in Rangoon, Burma, separated from her family, her political movement crushed, her country's military dictatorship seemingly invincible. She practiced vipassana meditation daily. She read. She maintained the discipline of her inner life with the same rigor that the regime maintained the discipline of her confinement. Her freedom was not political that had been taken. It was inner, and it could not be taken because it was not located in anything the regime controlled, i.v. The Stoic practice of distinguishing what is in one's control from what is not is the foundation of all Inner Freedom 5. Cultivating inner freedom in comfortable conditions is the preparation for maintaining it in difficult ones. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, the deliberate, regular contemplation of what one might lose, was not a morbid exercise. It was, in the Stoic account, the most practical possible preparation for inner freedom. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, recommends setting aside time each day to imagine the loss of what one holds most dear, the fortune, the health, the people. Not to produce anxiety, but to preempt it, to rehearse in imagination the discovery that one can survive without what one currently depends on. This is what the Stoics called the hedging of external goods, holding all of fortune's gifts lightly, with gratitude, but without grip. Paul's letter to the Philippians, written, like Boethius's consolation, from imprisonment, expresses an identical discovery from within a different tradition. I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. The word learned is crucial. This is not a temperamental gift Paul was born with. It is a discipline he acquired, a practiced loosening of the grip on external circumstances that prepared him for the specific circumstance in which he was writing. Buddhist nirvana as deathlessness points in the same direction. The liberated mind is not one that has escaped impermanence, but one that no longer clings to permanence. The freedom is in the release of the grip. The Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians from a Roman prison, likely the Mamertine prison or a form of house arrest in Rome, circa 62 CE. In it, he declares, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. The word learned is the key. Paul's inner freedom was not a gift of temperament. It was acquired through practice, through the repeated experience of both abundance and deprivation, and the discovery that neither defined him. Musonius Rufus, the Stoic teacher known as the Roman Socrates, was exiled twice, once to the barren island of Gyaros in the Aegean. On Gyaros, he continued to teach the few students who followed him, demonstrating by his own example that a philosopher's school does not require a city, a building, or even an audience. The inner freedom he taught was visible in the fact that his teaching continued in the absence of every external support. Spinoza, excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1656 and effectively exiled from every community that might have supported him, found his inner freedom in the act of thinking itself. He ground lenses for a living and wrote the Ethics in Solitude, a work that demonstrates, through its geometric method, that freedom is not the absence of necessity, but the understanding of it. The person who understands why they act as they do is free in a way that the person who merely acts on impulse can never be. The Buddhist concept of sunyata, emptiness, is paradoxically a teaching on freedom. When the mind recognizes that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, that nothing possesses a fixed, independent self-nature, the grip of attachment loosens. The person does not become empty. They recognize that they already are empty, that the solidity they attributed to their own identity was a construction. This recognition, which sounds like a loss, is experienced as liberation. The constructed self was a prison. Its dissolution is freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to be free, that consciousness is, by its very nature, a negation of what is given, and that this negation constitutes an inescapable freedom. You cannot not choose. Even the refusal to choose is a choice. Sartre's existential freedom is not the comfortable freedom of having many options. It is the vertiginous freedom of being responsible for everything you do, including the meaning you assign to your circumstances. Camus, Sartre's friend and eventual adversary, explored inner freedom through the myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time. Camus concluded that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because his situation is good, but because his inner freedom, his capacity to choose his attitude toward a situation he cannot change, is indestructible. The rock rolls back, Sisyphus walks down, and in that walk, Camus insists, he is free. Václav Havel, the Czech playwright who became president, argued that the most important form of freedom is the freedom to live within the truth. Under the totalitarian regime of communist Czechoslovakia, the greengrocer who refuses to place the party's slogan in his window has exercised a freedom more fundamental than any political liberty. He has chosen truth over compliance. This inner act, invisible, unglamorous, potentially dangerous, is the seed from which political freedom eventually grows. The traditions of inner freedom converge on a practice that is simultaneously the simplest and the most demanding. The daily, unglamorous discipline of distinguishing what is in one's control from what is not, and then returning again and again to what is. Epictetus recommended this examination as the first act of every morning and the last act of every evening, not a review of what had happened, but a review of how one had responded. Had the will remained in its own domain? Had the judgment been allowed to be disturbed by what was strictly none of its business? This is not a heroic practice. It is a small, repeated, cumulative one, closer to the practice of a musician who runs scales each morning, not for the performance that day, but for the finger strength that compounds over years. The freedom that Frankl found in Auschwitz and that Boethius found in his cell was not produced by those conditions. It had been built by exactly this kind of ordinary, daily, inconspicuous cultivation. The crisis revealed what was there. The practice is what put it there. Etihillism writing her diary during the German occupation of Amsterdam, provides one of the most remarkable accounts of inner freedom under extreme duress. As the deportations began, she wrote, "I have already died 1,000 deaths in 1,000 concentration camps. I know about everything and am no longer appalled by the latest reports. In one way or another, I know it all, and yet I find life beautiful and meaningful." Her inner freedom was not denial. It was the refusal to allow external horror to determine the quality of her interior life. Weil wrote that the capacity to say "I" in the midst of suffering, to maintain the first-person perspective, to remain a subject rather than being reduced to an object, is the essence of inner freedom. The totalitarian project, in whatever form it takes, aims to destroy this capacity, to reduce the person to a function, a number, a unit of labor. The person who maintains their "I" in these conditions has preserved the thing that the system most wants to destroy. The Stoic concept of the inner citadel, the mental fortress that Marcus Aurelius described, is not a metaphor for withdrawal from the world. It is the recognition that the quality of one's inner life is the one thing that remains sovereign in every condition. The citadel is not a retreat. It is the foundation from which all genuine engagement with the world proceeds. Frankl observed in the camps that the prisoners who survived longest were not always the physically strongest. They were often the ones who maintained an inner purpose, a reason to live that the conditions could not destroy. One man lived for the scientific work he would resume after liberation. Another lived for the child he hoped was still alive. The inner purpose was not a guarantee of survival, but its absence was, Frankl observed, frequently a prelude to collapse. Gandhi's practice of satyagraha, truth force, or soul force, is a political application of inner freedom. The person who practices satyagraha does not resist the oppressor with violence. They resist by refusing to be internally broken by the oppressor's violence. They accept suffering without retaliation, not from weakness, but from a strength that the oppressor cannot match, because it is located in a dimension the oppressor's weapons cannot reach. The Buddhist story of Angulimala, the serial killer who encountered the Buddha and was transformed, illustrates the radical claim that inner freedom is available even to the person who has committed the worst acts. The Buddha did not ask Angulimala to undo what he had done. He asked him to stop. The freedom was in the stopping, in the discovery that the person is not identical with their history, that the capacity for a different response is always available, regardless of what has come before. Martin Luther King Jr., writing his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, articulated a form of inner freedom that was simultaneously personal and political. He did not merely accept imprisonment. He used it as a pulpit, as a writing desk, as a demonstration that the person who acts from conscience possesses a freedom that the jail cannot contain. The letter, written on the margins of newspapers smuggled into his cell, became one of the most important documents in the American tradition of freedom. The Dalai Lama, in exile from Tibet since 1959, has practiced inner freedom for more than 60 years in the absence of his homeland. His response to the Chinese occupation, compassion rather than hatred for the occupiers, is not a political strategy. It is the application of Buddhist inner freedom to the most painful possible circumstances. The person who maintains compassion for the one who has taken everything from them has demonstrated a freedom that the occupation cannot reach. Dostoevsky, who spent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp for his involvement in a political reading circle, understood inner freedom as something that can be born in conditions that were designed to kill it. In The House of the Dead, his fictionalized account of the camp, he describes prisoners who maintained their humanity through acts so small they might seem insignificant, sharing food, telling stories, caring for a wounded bird. These acts were not political resistance. They were the exercise of an inner freedom that the camp's regulations could not prohibit because they could not detect it. James Stockdale, the American naval officer who spent 7 years as a prisoner of war in the Hanoi Hilton, credited Epictetus with his survival. He had studied the Enchiridion as a student at Stanford and carried its teachings into combat. When his plane was shot down over North Vietnam, he later recalled saying to himself, "I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus." The philosophy that a slave had developed 2,000 years earlier sustained a prisoner of war in conditions its author would have recognized. What the traditions of inner freedom finally offer is not a consolation prize for people who have lost their outer freedom, though it has served this function and served it genuinely. What they offer is a reorientation of what freedom means. The person who believes that their freedom is entirely dependent on favorable external conditions is in a precarious position regardless of how favorable the conditions currently are. The person who has located their freedom in the inner life, in the orientation of the will, the quality of the attention, the integrity of the soul's self-governance, is in a position that is far more durable, not invulnerable. Frankl did not pretend that inner freedom made the camps bearable in an ordinary sense. Boethius did not escape his execution. Solzhenitsyn spent 8 years in conditions of genuine deprivation. But in each case, what was preserved was the most important thing. And what was preserved in those conditions turns out to be the most important thing in comfortable ones as well. The traditions are not talking about extreme situations. They are describing the structure of a life well-founded. The traditions of inner freedom do not promise happiness. They promise something more durable. the capacity to remain oneself in conditions that are designed to make you someone else. This capacity is not given. It is built through daily practice, through the cultivation of the philosophical or spiritual discipline that locates freedom where no external force can reach it. The crisis does not build the freedom. The crisis reveals whether the freedom was built before the crisis arrived. If this reached you at the right time, subscribe. We explore the deepest questions of human existence every week, so you can live yours more